This presentation, you will learn how traditional knowledge was transmitted. Firstly, let us understand what we mean by Indian knowledge system. Indian knowledge system, or IKS, refers to the vast body of traditional, indigenous, that means Indian, and classical knowledge developed and sustained, that means that was developed and remained in the Indian subcontinent over millions of years. Rooted in the Indian worldview, it covers disciplines like philosophy, language, science, math, architecture, arts, medicine, ecology, and spirituality. So, what we mean to say is that Indian knowledge system is made up of all these subjects. It has a part to play in all these subjects. A core component of IKS is its unique modes of knowledge transmission, which emphasize experiential, that means to experience something, holistic, which means all round development, and contextual learning, that means in reference to everyday life. This is often passed on orally, that means through words, symbolically, through symbols, through buildings, through various symbols that we see around us, and later in the written form. Meaning of traditional knowledge transmission. Traditional knowledge transmission refers to the methods by which knowledge, values, beliefs, customs, and cultural practices are passed on from one generation to another within a community or society. In the Indian context, this transmission is deeply embedded or is in oral traditions, symbolic expressions, and sacred or religious texts. So let us look at the first type. The first type is oral transmission. This refers to the passing of knowledge through spoken word, storytelling, songs, chants, poems, and verbal teachings. It is one of the oldest and most widespread means of communication and education in traditional societies. So, we are all aware that in the olden days, storytelling from one generation to the other, various songs about a community, about a society, and different values that were given from parents to children formed oral transmission. The key features. What is it that is important about oral transmission? Is firstly, it is interpersonal. It is from one person to another. So, it requires face to face interaction between the elders and the learners. So, it's more on a one to one basis. It is dynamic. What do we mean by dynamic? It means that it can evolve over time as stories and teachings are adapted. So it keeps changing over time, it doesn't stay static. Contextual, often transmitted in specific social, spiritual, or ritual settings. So there is a specific context to what you're studying. For example, if somebody is teaching you or telling you about the values that you must have of respecting your elders, of taking care of your parents in their old age. So there is context to what they're trying to say. Or there are spiritual teachings. There are reasons behind those spiritual teachings or values that are given to you. Or there is some meaning behind the rituals that you practice. So these are told to you from generation to generation, and you keep learning and you teach your children too. The various forms of oral transmission. Folklore, that means folk stories, and myths, various stories from mythology. So, narratives explaining natural phenomena, cultural origins, or moral lessons. It can also be transmitted through songs and chants, which are used in rituals, ceremonies, for example, certain songs that are sung at weddings and work settings. For example, farming songs. Agriculturists, while they're at the farm and working together, probably sing some related songs, and thus the tradition continues. Proverbs and sayings. A lot of wisdom is given from generation to generation through proverbs or what we call muhavras. Oral histories, recounting historical events and genealogies to maintain social memory. So, a lot of the older grandparents keep telling stories about what happened in their times, and these stories are then passed from one generation to the next. Advantages of oral transmission. It allows for emotional and personal connection. So you feel connected because you've spoken to the senior person who has given you the history behind your family, for example. It is accessible to all regardless of literacy. So even if you're not able to read and write, you are able to understand what somebody else is telling you. So it's accessible to all. Can adapt to changing cultural and environmental contexts. So it changes according to the culture of that time or the environment of that time. So the stories can be adapted and still taken forward over the years. However, there are some limitations. Vulnerable to loss if not actively practiced. So now if we don't practice those or sing those songs or use those chants, we may forget about them. So we lose on those chants or those songs that we are not singing anymore. It is memory based. So a lot of times we tend to forget. So details may change or degrade over time, or we may change the story entirely. So it could be a problem. In the Indian context, here are some examples. Guru Shishya Parampara, that is teacher disciple tradition. Now we know that the Gurukul system existed in old times, and the Guru would teach the children or the students, Shishyas, through oral transmission. So, this was the foundation of oral transmission in India, where they learned through dialogue, that means discussions, memorization, learning some things by heart, recitation, so reciting, repeatedly saying the same things over and over again, and reflection, which is thinking about what is taught to you. Subjects like the Vedas, music, dance, and martial arts were passed down orally. So, all these subjects were given to the students through oral communication. Storytelling traditions. Epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which you are all familiar with, were transmitted through kathas or narratives, kirtans, Puranic tales, and folk performances such as Harikatha, Kathakali, Yakshagana, Bhavai, and Terukuttu. Community oral records, castes, tribes, and local communities kept historical and genealogical, that means related to their genes, so the chronological records orally. So they used to tell each generation about their background, such as the bardic traditions of Rajasthan or Pandavani in Chhattisgarh. Now let us understand how oral traditions are relevant to media studies. Oral traditions form the basis of early Indian communication systems. They are precursors, that means they were before radio journalism, before we recorded our voice in voiceover narration, oral journalism, and audio documentary. So they were first started, and now we have these modern techniques. These methods provide models for interactive and participatory media. Because we orally share information, we can have interactive medium. For example, I am orally explaining to you about this particular topic. Our second type is written transmission. This involves encoding knowledge in a visual form using scripts, so you can write it in a particular language, or symbols or alphabets on mediums such as, so in early times they wrote on the bark of a tree, on parchment paper, palm leaves, inscription on stones, and finally on paper. So writing also has gone through various phases, and finally we now write on paper. The key features: firstly, it forms a permanent record. Therefore, it preserves knowledge across time and geography. For example, Ashoka used to have those edicts written out in various places in his kingdom. So, this became a permanent record, and this is something we see even today. Written transmission is standardized. It means that it is consistent, it is constant, and can support complex ideas. Because we are able to read the language, we are able to have our own ideas and views by reading that information. Written transmission is formalized. It is associated with religious teachings, legal practice, as well as it is used in education. All of you write your exams these days. So it is definitely helpful for us even in education. The various forms of written transmission: sacred texts, that means religious books, scriptures like the Vedas, the Quran, or the Bible were all in written format. Instructional manuals. So, herbal medicine guides in Ayurveda have been written out so that their followers can also use those medicines. Craft techniques, agricultural calendars are all written out. Legal codes and charters, documentation of laws and land rights. So we have our property papers, they're all written, so we can use them when we want to claim our inheritance or property owned by our parents. Historical chronicles, a lot of histories have been written. There were historians who wrote about the king. There are epics that we read about even today, and there are biographies of various people which help us understand more about them. The advantages of written transmission: it helps to preserve detailed, structured knowledge. So we get information because there was written transmission. It enables broader dissemination of ideas. So it helps in spreading ideas that were written down from olden days. It supports cross-generational learning without distortion. So you can refer to the old text even today. So nobody can misguide you or distort the information. You can get clarification because the matter was already written. However, there are some limitations. For example, if you are not literate or you do not know how to read the language, you will not be able to read the written matter. This written matter can become static, so it can be relevant to only a certain period of time, and therefore you may not be able to adapt it in today's situation. Or it may centralize knowledge, restricting access. So certain information may not be available to everybody because it has probably been lost over the years. In the Indian context, written transmission was preserved orally as well as passed on from generation to generation. So in the old days, we didn't have written material and we were depending only on oral information. However, from around 1st millennium BCE, Sanskrit texts were codified in manuscripts. So we started having new Sanskrit texts which were in manuscript form on palm leaves or on the bark of the birch tree. So from oral, we started to have manuscripts. The example of these texts are Vedas, Upanishads, Smritis, Ayurvedic texts like the Charaka Samhita, Sushruta Samhita, Natya Shastra, which was the foundational text on performance, aesthetics, and dramaturgy or drama. Let us understand how written transmission is important to media studies. So, written traditions offer early models of content creation, curation, that means putting together, and dissemination, which means the spread of information. Manuscript tradition demonstrates archival practice. Archives are those where we save old information. So we could save old information because they were available to us as manuscripts. Editing skills and graphic layout principles. By looking at how the older people laid out maybe their newspapers or information, we improvised our layouts that we have today. So now we have very fancy layouts, but we began in a simple way by looking at traditional written material. The influence of written tradition is also seen in script writing or in calligraphy, which is very artistic, in copywriting, and in print journalism. So, written transmission has had its impact over the years on all these aspects. Our third type is symbolic transmission. Symbolic transmission uses non-verbal and often visual or performative means to convey knowledge and meaning. What we mean by that is what we understand when we see a dance performance, or what we understand when we see some artwork, or if we see a historical building, a monument, or a material culture. Material culture means totems or carvings on certain walls, certain stones, and these symbols help us get information. The main features of symbolic transmission, it is multi-layered. So what we mean by that is one symbol can have many meanings. So it can represent complex ideas or it can have very abstract ideas. It depends on each one's point of view. It could be culture specific, so deeply rooted in the worldview and environment of a community. So the carvings can represent the life or the history of a particular community. For example, we have Varli art, which depicts the life of the people or the Varli people. Embedded in practice, this means that it has everyday activities, so often found in everyday objects or spiritual practices. For example, in the Indus Valley, we found pots and pans. So we assumed that they were using those utensils as part of their cooking. The forms of symbolic transmission could be totems and emblems. So a totem is basically a symbol that represents a particular group of people. So it represents a clan identity, it represents their social roles or their society or cosmology. Rituals and ceremonies. These transmit values, myths, and communal identity. For example, post marriage, a Hindu woman will wear a Mangal Sutra. So, the Mangal Sutra in Indian context simply symbolizes a ritual of a marriage, and post the ceremony, one would wear a Mangal Sutra. Body art and dress. This encodes age, status, marital status, religious affiliation. For example, religious people wear a particular outfit which helps us differentiate them as religious. A lot of us dress according to our age also. So you will find senior people wearing a certain kind of dress code. You'll find youngsters wearing a different kind of dress code. So these are symbols that help us recognize various status in society. Symbolic landscapes. For example, a religious center will be peaceful, calm, will have probably an idol or something that we can worship, or people will be in a very respectful manner. So sacred grooves can be recognized. We immediately see a sacred place and we understand that is the religious place. Burial mounds. So when we pass a graveyard, we know that this is where people have been buried. Or rock art sites with embedded narratives. So a lot of walls or buildings have inscriptions which we then recognize and we understand about their history. Advantages. Firstly, communicates ideas across language barriers. So, irrespective of what language you speak, you are able to understand. For example, the Taj Mahal, which is in Agra, we know that it was a symbol of love from the king to his queen. It can encapsulate intangible values and beliefs. So it doesn't have to be tangible. Tangible is something that you can touch and feel, but you get the value system of that time. You are able to understand the beliefs of that time. Offers holistic and experiential learning, gives you an experience of what life must have been in those days. For example, if you go and trek in Lohagarh or Lonavala, you find a lot of forts that are there, and you understand how life was in those days. However, there are some limitations. For example, interpretation may be difficult without cultural context. If you do not have the cultural background, you may wrongly interpret or wrongly understand what the symbol is. Symbolic meaning can be lost or misinterpreted. So, someone may forget what the symbol means, or you may misinterpret or wrongly express what the symbol is according to the time. Often requires participation to be fully understood. So sometimes we need symbols that are common. If they're not very common, we may not be able to understand the symbol that is being transmitted. Now, in the Indian context, let us understand symbolic transmission. Knowledge was also encoded in non-verbal and symbolic forms such as temple architecture. So when we look at our temples, there's a lot of messages that come across to us. Okay, murals or carvings, mandalas have a lot of meaning. There's a story sometimes in the mandala which you can look at and understand. Iconography are original pictures which send us a lot of meaning. They have been done by the artist in a particular way to send a particular idea across. Rituals are practices. The rituals that we follow, even in our homes, are done for a particular reason. So there's a symbolic importance to that ritual. Our festivals are also symbols of our religion, and various dance forms tell us stories or give us information about a particular community. The mudras in dance or the bhav rasa theory in aesthetics. These are important forms of symbols. These symbolic systems convey values, cosmologies, and social codes. So we are able to understand various values through the symbols. Let us look at the relevance to media studies, the predecessors to visual communication. So before we actually had visual communication and modern symbols, symbology was already existing, and those were prior to visual communication. Semiotics we had learned in as the language of signs. So to understand semiotics and cinematic language, to understand the background in which a movie is being made, the background history in which a movie is placed. It is also a rich source for understanding visual storytelling. We are able to design our sets according to the historical times. We are able to design costumes according to the story and the scene. Mise en scène is simply the scene that we also design according to the historical background. Useful in analyzing advertising symbols, branding, and logo design. So, through symbols, we have learned to use symbols in advertising, to use brand symbols, and to design logos thanks to ancient times where there were symbols already being used. So, let us now look at the overall information that we collected about IKS and knowledge transmission. Firstly, as I told you, it is holistic. When we say holistic, it means that it is all encompassing. It is for the holistic development of the individual. So it involves everything about the individual, from the physical body, the mind, the spirit, and the environment around that particular individual. Our second point is it's experiential. When we say experiential, we mean something we can experience. Learning through doing. So practice is the key. If you practice writing, your handwriting will automatically improve. So only with the experience will you improvise. It is community based, which means you learn about your society, you learn about your religion through your community, through your group of people. It is contextual. It means it is related to or tied to a certain time, a certain place, and it has a certain purpose. It is interdisciplinary. It simply means it does not belong to only one subject, but it blends in with all subjects like science, arts, ethics, philosophy. Why is it relevant to media studies today? Firstly, we are decolonizing curriculum. When we say decolonizing, we were given the Western education because at that time the British had introduced English education. So we need to understand that we also share Indian knowledge system transmission as part of our literacy process. Second point, we reclaim indigenous media. So we relive our oral and symbolic traditions, which are very rich in their own form and therefore help us to portray media through tradition. Third point, content development. Traditional forms inspire storytelling techniques, audiovisual formats, and documentary styles. So we can develop a content according to the older systems of storytelling, of putting across a story to send some value system to the youngsters. Okay, so our content can also be developed accordingly. Digital revival. So, podcasts, storytelling apps, and heritage archives, which give information about our past, help to bring back traditional media models in a digital format. So, we can modernize our information and pass it on to the coming generations. Contemporary examples and applications. So here we have modern examples like Doordarshan's mythological series, where Doordarshan aired Ramayana and Mahabharata, which was mirroring or showing us oral and symbolic storytelling. There are podcasts like Kahaniyon Ka Safar, which revives old narratives which were orally transmitted previously. There is also the use of folk media in rural communities even today, where various campaigns for health and education are done through little dramas within the village so that the local people are able to understand the importance of health and the importance of education today. There are also documentary films which explore the tribal life, tribal history, or any sacred art forms, and therefore these are transmitted to the newer generations too. Traditional systems of knowledge transmission are three types: oral, written, and symbolic, are not mutually exclusive. What we mean is they're not separate. They coexist. We write, we speak, as well as we understand symbols all together. So, in many societies, they coexist and complement one another. Altogether, they ensure the continuity of culture, identity, and survival strategies. Because we have them together, we are able to understand how a society works. In the face of globalization and modernization, it is important to safeguard these systems in order to sustain our cultural diversity and ecological wisdom. So, we want to sustain them because otherwise, we are losing out on our culture because of new global ideas and modernization. So, our value systems must remain even though we modernize ourselves into a global society. Indian knowledge system, offers a rich, multidimensional model of knowledge transmission that goes beyond text, and it incorporates, that means it involves oral, symbolic, and lived experiences. For media studies, engaging with these traditional forms not only enhances understanding of India's communication heritage, but also opens up diverse and inclusive media practices that speak to a wider audience in the digital age. So, even today, our history is very relevant. Thank you for watching the presentation. Do like, share, subscribe, and leave your comments about this presentation or any other topic you would like to learn more about.